Thanks for coming out, everyone. I know we've got some kids getting chairs coming in the back, so it's good to have a large crowd at any event. I'm Tom Lenny. Welcome to Ream Library. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at the college. The McFarland Center sponsors lectures, conferences, programming, other special events that explore questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. I'm really happy tonight to welcome a distinguished alumnus, a distinguished intellectual, Kevin Madigan of the class of '82, back to campus. On most campuses, I suspect it would be hard to get an over full room for a talk about the Middle Ages, about the Crusades, I suspect. But here, our talk has special salience, of course, because we have the name Crusader as the moniker that the college has used for the last 80 or so years. The name has been one that's inspired loyalty, camaraderie, generosity, and it's also been seen by some members of the community as problematic in ways that we as an institution might not have fully examined. Last summer, in response to the Milady Healy Legacy Committee report, Father Burrows, our president, indicated that he also heard questions during that process about the college's use of the name Crusader. He agreed that we could bring and should examine its meaning in the contemporary context in light of our commitment to interreligious understanding. In anticipation of a discussion about the name and how it reflects the mission of Holy Cross, the McFarland Center decided to devote 2 events to better educate ourselves about the history behind the Crusades and about the meaning and symbolism behind the name today. If we want to call ourselves Crusaders, what do we need to know as a community about the history and historiography of the Crusades? Tonight, we're lucky to have a distinguished intellectual, a scholar of medieval Christianity, to lay out the issues around the Crusades themselves. He'll also help us to think about what lenses historians have brought to thinking about the Crusades at different points over the years. We'll follow that presentation with a faculty panel on April 11th, which faculty will explore through their academic disciplines questions of identity, meaning, memory, belonging, and history that are wrapped up in that Crusader moniker. You can learn more about that event and see this event recorded online at holycross.edu/McFarland Center. With that said, let me introduce Kevin Madigan. He's a very proud Holy Cross alum. We were talking about that. He was telling me his nephew graduated about 5 years ago. He's here tonight with his wife, Stephanie Paulson. Stephanie, there we go. Stephanie's down at the end. And with a very large contingent of the class of '82, his friends, the class of '82 can all raise their hands, right? Who are here to, I don't know, to cheer him on or to give him a hard time, or both at dinner. It was hard to tell which was true. Kevin is the Wynne Professor of Ecclesiastical History at Harvard Divinity School. He specializes in medieval Christian history and is the author of a really wonderful, comprehensive textbook on the medieval church entitled Medieval Christianity, A New History, which was published in 2015 by Yale University Press. I learned tonight that Professor Joanne Pierce's students are reading that in class, so we've got some readers right here. The great Notre Dame scholar John Van Engen said of this book that it will undoubtedly be the fundamental narrative account of medieval Christianity for the next generation, that it's engagingly written, and I enjoyed it very much, enjoyed reading it. When I was in college, I had a great love of medieval history. I didn't go on in it, but it was great to come back and read that. He's also the author of Olivet and the Interpretation of Matthew in the High Middle Ages, and The Passions of Christ in High Medieval Thought, an essay on Christological development. He co-authored Ordained Women in the Early Church, a documentary history, and Resurrection, the Power of God for Christians and Jews with John Levinson. Professor Madigan also regularly teaches courses on the Holocaust and is published on the Roman Catholic Church during the Nazi period. He spent last year at the Vatican Archives researching the treatment of religious minorities in the church in the fascist period. He's co-editor of the Harvard Theological Review and serves on the editorial board of the Journal of the American Academy of Religion. At Holy Cross, however, he studied English literature. He had a different. Anyway, please join me in welcoming Professor Kevin Madigan.
Thank you so much, Tom. Appreciate it. Well, thank you very much, Tom, for that very kind introduction, and thanks to you all for coming out tonight on this cold Thursday evening. I'm very, very happy to be back on Mount St. James, and when I come back, I'm always reminded about how much I owe to the school and to my teachers. And I want to thank in particular Bill Reiser, who is here somewhere, who was my teacher and has been my mentor and friend now for 30 years. I want to thank my 7 or 8 friends from the class of 1982, and I want to thank all my fellow Crusaders for at least some time, for being here. Okay, so why don't we begin? The title of my talk, first of all, can everybody hear me? Okay, great. The title of my talk is The Crusades and Crusaders, History and Historiography. Okay, so on November 27th, 1095, Pope Urban II, in a field outside the French city of Clermont, where a council was then being held, made an appeal to his auditors to come to the aid of Eastern Christians. The tangible outcome of this appeal was a military expedition undertaken by Western Christians. And this undertaking we know today as the First Crusade. Aimed mainly at French knights, Pope Urban's call came in response to a request by the Byzantine Emperor Alexius I. 8 months earlier, the emperor had sent 2 of his commissioners to Urban, who was then at the Council of Piacenza in Italy. The representatives of the emperor appealed to the Pope to help recover Asiatic provinces, that is, provinces in Asia Minor or present-day Eastern Turkey. Those provinces had been lost to a new and fearsome Muslim power, the Seljuk Turks. In the 11th century, the Seljuks, having migrated from their ancient homeland in Persia and having converted to Islam, pushed the Fatimid Caliphate southward and established a grand empire. This empire came to encompass, as you can see, large parts of the once Christian world. And these included Armenia, Syria, Palestine, and now Asia. It had encroached, that is, on territory thought by Western as well as by Eastern Christians to belong to the Christian Byzantine Empire. So close had the Turks come to the city of Constantinople that residents of the capital could peer across the Bosphorus, that is the narrow strait separating the European from the Asian peninsula, and glimpse land held by the Turks. It must have been a deeply unsettling prospect. Since the early 4th century and the conversion to Christianity of the Roman Emperor Constantine, Jerusalem had been a pilgrimage center. Now, by the time of the First Crusade, the Holy Land had been in Muslim hands for almost 5 centuries. Before the Persians had crept this close to Eastern Christendom, Arab Muslims had allowed Christians on pilgrimage to pray at the shrines of the Holy Land. This was not in the first instance for reasons of religious tolerance. Rather, it was a matter of economic motivation. Pilgrims streamed into the region, and money poured into the pockets of Muslim political leaders and merchants. By contrast, when the Seljuks conquered Jerusalem, they were appalled to discover that monasteries and churches were allowed to flourish, that is, in what they regarded as Muslim territory. Indignant, they apprehended pilgrims, or were said to have done so, mutilated clergy, and razed churches. When the Eastern Emperor's commissioners appealed to Urban at Piacenza, they reported that the Turks had now blocked the route for pilgrims to the holy places. Now, in an age when Western Christians wished to undertake pilgrimage to these very places, the news received by Pope Urban must have profoundly distressed them. His unhappiness had its source in large part in medieval attitudes towards Jerusalem, on which more below. Suffice to say for the moment that the factor distinguishing the Crusades from the subsequent, almost relentless conflict for control of the Mediterranean between Western and Muslim powers was Christian devotion to and enthusiasm for the Holy Land, above all Jerusalem. Now, Urban's appeal to the nobility and to the knighthood was powerfully seductive. This was in part because he knew very well how his audience's mind worked. First of all, he himself was the son of a minor noble, and thus he came from a family of fighting men. Warrior elites, such as his father and relatives, were immersed on a regular basis in violence and homicide, a very serious sin. Warriors could hardly keep pace with the debt of penance they were accumulating, in much the same way that your speaker tonight has difficulty keeping pace with his credit card debt, as his wife can testify. Though baptized, they hardly fit prevailing religious ideals, these warriors, as those in cloisters ubiquitous in medieval Europe preserved an ideal of holiness based on abdication of the world, renunciation of property, ascetic zeal, the observance of chastity, obedience, and the subordination of the individual will. Here, at last, the knightly class of Europe, of whom, because of its proclivity, and it seemed even its fondness for violence, the clerical class often despaired. The knightly class were now offered a religious activity expressly conceived for them. As a reward for liberating the Holy Land, Urban bestowed on knights who voluntarily undertook the cross complete remission of sin. As one French cleric observed at the time, the warrior could now realistically aspire to salvation. He need only canalize or channel his martial prowess in ways that matched the ambitions of the church as expressed by the papacy. Urban's appeal also dovetailed very nicely with the system of contractual relationships known to us all since high school by the shorthand word of feudalism. And this, of course, was the system of social relations that by 1096 ubiquitously bound men to protect one another, as well as by attachment to a small group of kin. And as you all know, Western Europe had been, by roughly 1100, permeated with ideas of lordship. Almost everybody was a lord or subject to one. Now, this system of social relations imposed on both parties, among other things, the obligation to avenge injury. And here feudalism joined up naturally with contemporary notions of kin, whose members were obliged to protect one another and to guard one another's interests. Members of a kin group were, for example, bound to defend or avenge an injured relative, thus the prevalence of the blood feud or vendetta. So call to mind no less a figure than the great scholastic Peter Abelard, right, who was emasculated by Heloise's kin, as probably many of you recall. Was it, Urban pointedly asked at Clermont, was it not the obligation of every vassal to come to the aid of his lord if that lord's lands were unjustly seized? How much more, then, did the vassals of Western Christendom owe to their divine lord? Christ, Pope Urban broadcast in a sermon at Clermont and in the preaching tour that followed, was just then again being crucified in the persecution of the faithful and in the desecration of Eastern monasteries and churches. Finally, and crucially, the kin group was keenly conscious of the family estate, the patrimony, on which the family interests concentrated. To the knights of Europe, then, Urban couched his appeal in terms they could easily apprehend. He gave them religious duties to undertake that matched their own profound but often unexpressed religious yearnings. As one historian has memorably put it, quote, a nerve of exquisite feeling had been touched in the warrior classes of the West. Brought by the Pope's persuasion to the brink of something like sacred fury, the knights present at Clermont were legendarily reported to have bellowed out in unison, Deus vult, or God wills it. So it was with this premeditated and powerfully attractive appeal that the First Crusade was launched. It's with this background in mind, too, that I would like to take a moment to frame my remarks tonight on the Crusades and the Crusaders, and to state the aim, scope, and especially limits of my observations this evening. First, though my remarks tonight will be delivered in the context of larger discussions centering on the future of the college's moniker, I am more or less strictly concerned tonight as an historian with definition, description, and explanation. And I'll strive to achieve, as an alumnus hopeful of furnishing reliable data and analysis for these conversations, simplicity, clarity, and understanding. I intend, in particular, to zero in on how medieval crusaders understood themselves, and especially on their religious motivations. I therefore will not dwell tonight on the details of war or weapons, on which I'm neither expert, and which are not obviously relevant, so far as I can see, to the college's forthcoming discussions. Second, I aim to understand and to help us understand the Crusaders as medieval Western Christians understood them. Though not the case in the 11th century, the category of holy war may seem today, and for good reason, a dangerous oxymoron. We, our parents, and their parents spent and sometimes lost their lives in a century during which wars were begun almost exclusively for profane, immoral, and sometimes even fiendish purposes. Yet without appreciating the genuine religious motivations of the Crusaders, I want to suggest we simply cannot understand the Crusades as medieval Christians, be they popes, prelates, princes, or the people, perceive them. Nor, for that matter, can we understand why the students of the Holy Cross, of the College of the Holy Cross, in the first half of the 20th century, wished to associate themselves with the image of the medieval Crusaders, or why the Jesuit leaders of the college were likely pleased with that choice. Finally, I want to make a few brief comments about the historiography of the Crusades, or the history of how the Crusades have been culturally received and interpreted by historians. For perhaps self-evident reasons, I'll focus my historiographical remarks on the study of the Crusades in the 19th and 20th century. Since the college was founded in the middle of the 19th, and its moniker chosen in the first quarter of the 20th, zeroing in on scholarship and other cultural products like art, zeroing in on culture in the period from 1850 to 1950 is likely to give us a good sense of why Crusaders was chosen as the historic and then honored image with which students, professors, and the leaders of the college took pride in identifying themselves. Okay. So let me begin then, for the sake of clarity, to define, insofar as possible, what medieval Christians meant when referring to a crusader, or how a canon lawyer in the 12th and 13th centuries might have defined a crusade. As both an idea and an event, the medieval crusade was not an utter novum, a sheer novelty. Rather, it was a synthesis of existing medieval religious ideas and practices, especially just war, holy war, the making of religious vows, the indulgence, and above all, the well-established practice of pilgrimage. Now, ironically, we go a long way to understanding the Crusades and the Crusaders by recognizing that, examining the earliest sources, we find no term in medieval Latin or the old European vernaculars that distinguish crusade from pilgrimage. The cross as a distinguishing mark of crusading, as distinct from pilgrimage, appears first in the sources only at the end of the 12th century, or about 100 years after the First Crusade was launched. In fact, the earliest known use of the term crusade is not found until the 13th century in Spain and southwestern France. Yet, the use of the term still remained rare, and in English, the word crusade was not common before the 18th century. Participants in the Crusades in the early sources were customarily referred to as pilgrims. They were also described, even more simply, as Christians. In some cases, they were characterized as, and this is more telling, those bound for Jerusalem. Our modern English word for crusader derives from the Latin words for those signed by or with the cross, a descriptive term used after the 12th century to refer to the Crusaders. So with these realities in mind, I offer the following broad definition of a medieval crusade that would, I think, have been recognized by those who authorized as well as by those who participated in one. So, a crusade was, first of all, an armed expedition or military pilgrimage undertaken for Christ and ipso facto just. That was, second, authorized exclusively by the papacy, in which, third, leading participants took religious vows, and four, enjoyed the protection of of protection at home. And finally, and crucially, were granted a papal indulgence that bestowed on all the warriors who completed their vow by praying at the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, full remission of sin. Okay. Now, despite the fact that crusades, were launched against internal European enemies like heretics, and that they occurred until the end of the Middle Ages, the traditional construction of the Crusades as a set of 9 expeditions launched between 1095 and 1291 remains popular. The first of the so-called numbered Crusades was launched in 1096 and concluded with the improbable capture of Jerusalem by the Western Crusaders in July of 1099. The last of the 9 numbered Crusades ended with the fall of Acre at the Haifa Bay in present-day Israel on May 18, 1291. Now, the territory on which the battles were fought was the Levant, or the Eastern Mediterranean littoral, and these territories comprised the current nations of Cyprus, Iraq, Israel, the Palestinian Authority, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and portions of Turkey. So, I will not tonight be covering the Crusades that took place within Europe, especially in southern France, in the Baltics, and Bohemia against those judged to be heretical between roughly 1300 and 1500. Rather, I plan to concentrate this evening on the Crusades, especially the first, that attempted to achieve 2 goals, though not in equal measure. First, to protect Byzantine or Eastern Christians, and second, to retake land, above all Jerusalem, thought to have been seized unjustly by Muslim political and military powers. To those, then, permit me now to turn. So, medieval Christians regarded virtually all journeys to the Levant, I stress again, as pilgrimages. They thus regarded the Crusades as religious journeys. And in the case of the Crusades, these expeditions were, of course, also military in nature and purpose. To put it directly, they were also wars. For that reason, historians find it necessary to understand the Crusades against the background of classical Christian ideas on the use of force, as well as the further development of these ideas on the eve of the First Crusade. Now, needless to say to this audience, the 5th commandment hallows a divine prohibition of homicide. Nonetheless, no later than the 4th century, some Christians, intellectuals, believed that there were certain circumstances when that commandment could be licitly or innocently breached. Those circumstances were discussed and came to be precisely defined in the 4th and 5th centuries by, among others, the great church father Augustine of Hippo. It was he, as many here know, who resurrected the aspects of the Roman concept of just war, especially as classically articulated in Cicero's treatise on duty, a tract composed roughly 50 years before the Common Era. And as many of you know, the intellectual product of Augustine's reflections is what is commonly known to us as the just war theory. Again, though well known to many here, permit me to recall the central criteria that grew out of Augustine's reflections, which were spread out over 4 decades and in many, many writings on righteous war. First, war must have a just cause. Ordinarily, aggression by one party and injury suffered by another. Second, only a legitimate authority could authorize the war. 5 centuries before Urban II launched the First Crusade, the Archbishop of Seville, Isidore, sometimes regarded as the last of the church fathers, ancient church fathers, summed up the first 2 criteria in a single sentence. Quote, "War is lawful and just when waged upon command, in order to recover property or to repel assaults." And that single rich sentence then passed into influential collections of canon law. It's found, for example, in the classic collection, usually called the Decretum, compiled in Bologna, in Italy, the medieval center of European legal thinking, around 1120 by the jurist and monk Gratian. By then, and even before the Crusades, other legal texts, canons, had been assembled by canonists, canon lawyers, that underpin the right of the church to invoke violence against a range of antagonists, including not just enemies of the peace, but heretics, excommunicates, and of course, the infidel. The third Augustinian criterion, usually defined as right intention, required that each soldier have pure motives. Finally, the critical fourth principle stipulated that war was to be undertaken solely as a last resort, after all other peaceful means of establishing order and justice had been exhausted and had failed. To be sure, violence was reckoned an unfortunate necessity in response to aggression or injustice, yet insofar as war supported the divine intention for humanity, it was understood to be in accordance with the purposes of God. Now, in the early Middle Ages, popes and emperors, acquainted with Augustine's conviction that injuries to God could be avenged, argued that the church possessed the authority, exercised again exclusively through the pope, to command imperial persecution of heretics. And this is a position, incidentally, to which Augustine, after initial hesitation, lent his authority in a 4th and 5th century conflict with the schismatic Donatist church in North Africa, which did indeed lead to imperial persecution of the Donatist church. Yet, it was the later reconquest of Spain that in many ways prepared the way, both conceptually and practically, for the church to bring the crusade into being. As is well known, in the year 711, Spain was conquered by the forces of the Umayyad Caliphate. Okay? And this began a very long series of skirmishes between Christians and Muslims for control of the Iberian Peninsula. Indeed, these clashes would not end until roughly 8 centuries after they began. I should emphasize here again that these conflicts were taken on with the conviction on the part of the Christians who fought in or authorized them that these lands, having been consecrated to Christ, belonged to Christians. It was, in Christian eyes, a matter of transitory injustice that infidels should dwell there, let alone dare to rule. 4 centuries of near constant warfare between the Moors and Spanish Christians preceded Urban's speech in Clermont. In fact, when Urban proclaimed the crusade in 1095, he immediately faced a problem he hadn't anticipated. Spanish knights reacted to his sermon with the same enthusiasm as those in France, and so suddenly that Urban had to find a way to dissuade Spanish warriors from joining the expedition to the Levant. Alarmed that the desertion of the Spanish warriors from the Iberian Peninsula would jeopardize the military success they then enjoyed, the Pope quickly attempted to establish an analogy between the reconquest of Spain and of the Holy Land. Both, he maintained, were intended to dispossess the infidel from unjust occupation of Christian territory. The Spanish army were to understand themselves as part of a great military host fighting on what we might call a second front of Christendom. Though it's almost certain that few Spaniards before 1100 identified the reconquest with the crusade, from 1098 onward, the papacy attempted to reinforce that identity. It did so above all by explicitly linking the full remission of sin owed to them with that granted to crusaders headed to Jerusalem. Now, the appearance and seductive attraction of Jerusalem, once it made its way into the ordinary discourse of popes and archbishops, really cinched the case. In 1125, for example, the Archbishop of Compostela in Spain broadcast that the reconquest was critical, in part because it would unlock, he says, and I quote here, a shorter and less laborious route through North Africa to the holy city of Jerusalem. Now, it's worth emphasizing that Pope Urban himself had been preoccupied with Spain before proclaiming this crusade to the Holy Land in 1095. And this is the main reason he could so easily assimilate the reconquest to the crusade. 1 year after becoming Pope in 1088, Urban, addressing Christian warriors in Spain, used the language of indulgences, as well as the term remission of sin, and even salvation in connection with the war. So far as the liberation of people went, then Urban regarded the new crusade to the east as part of a wider movement of Christian liberation. To emphasize, he did not distinguish it from the Spanish Reconquista. It was during the Reconquest, then, that we first hear language of wars fought for Christ, recovery of lands consecrated to him, and critically, the remission of sin for those fighting to re-Christianize the peninsula. Now, moving to the eve of the First Crusade, enthusiasm before it grew out of the 11th century papal reform, sometimes called the Gregorian Reform, after its most famous pontifical leader, Gregory VII, and other Gregorian reformers. Now, the watchwords of this reform were liberty and liberation. In fact, the importance of liberty was stressed as early as the year 910 in the foundation charter of the great Burgundian monastery at Cluny, whose benefactor gave the cloister freedom from his oversight or interference. Himself a Gregorian reformer, Urban II was, before his elevation to the throne of St. Peter, a Cluniac monk, not unimportantly. Another reforming pope, Alexander II, granted the first indulgence, I should say, for war to fighters in Spain in 1063, and he may well have given the right to bear a banner of St. Peter, Vexillum Sancti Petri, a mark of papal approval for a military venture. Thus, the self-determination of Cluniac cloisters, the Gregorian insistence on freedom of the church from lay domination, and the freedom of the papacy from imperial interference, each of these factors quite naturally fed into Urban's own avidity for the liberation of the Holy Land. More even than his predecessors, Gregory VII promoted ideas of a militia assembled at and put in the service of, as well as led by, the papacy. Approaching laymen for support, Gregory conceived the idea of a body of knights scattered throughout Western Christendom. These groups of knights were to be put at Peter's or his personal disposal, bound to the papacy by duty to the church and to him as its head. He commonly referred to these warriors, drawing on the fathomless medieval affection for St. Peter, as soldiers of St. Peter. And this militia of St. Peter was intended to protect the interests of his successors as Bishop of Rome as they saw fit. Now, an early example of Gregory's planned use of St. Peter's army came in reaction to the news of Turkish advances in Asia Minor after the defeat of the Greeks at Manzikert in 1071. Gregory twice summoned the faithful of St. Peter and all who wished to protect the Christians to give their lives to liberate their brothers in the East. Such a sacrifice, he continued, would be service to Christ and to defense of the Christian faith and the heavenly King. For such labor, he promised, quote, eternal reward. Gregory VII, who was dubbed by his fellow Cardinal Damian, all too accurately, I'm afraid, my holy Satan, announced that he himself would lead the expedition as leader and pope, Dux et Pontifex. Strictly speaking, what Gregory proposed differed in critical ways from the crusade preached by Urban II 21 years later. Gregory promised no indulgence. The Crusaders took no vow, and the protection of the church was not offered to the lands and families of the volunteers. That said, while Gregory emphasized the ideas of brotherly love to fellow Christians in extremis, he also suggested that an army might push on to the Holy Sepulchre. This demonstrates, as one historian has acutely perceived, quote, how once one began to think of the East, one's mind could turn so quickly to Jerusalem, end quote. Only a conflict with the German emperor over another issue of freedom, in this case the liberty to name the Archbishop of Milan, which was a see then technically in the territory of the emperor, only that contingency nudged Gregory from his plan to defend Byzantine Christians from the Turkish threat. In any event, Gregory imagined his expedition as an attempt, motivated, he said, by charity, to redress the injury to Byzantine Christians. Its loss of territory imposed on him an obligation, he thought, a felt obligation to use force in a just war. Hard though it may be for us to imagine, this was for Gregory a mission of mercy and a solemn obligation imposed by God. So we arrive now to the last of the 11th century Gregorian reformers, the one with whom we began, Pope Urban II. Now, by the time of his speech at Clermont, all but one of the elements of the Crusades were in place. One of the very few novel elements Urban introduced to the existing views of Christian holy war was that a knight was expected to take a vow. Needless to say, by the late 11th century, Christian vows already had a long history. Simply defined, a vow was an oath, ordinarily voluntary, but occasionally, as part of the discipline of penance and confession, involuntary. a solemn oath made to no man, but instead to God. Sacred vows committed one to perform certain acts, always commendable. Sacred acts committed one to perform certain acts, always commendable, or to act in certain ways, always honorable. In the case of the crusade vow, these acts were also meritorious. That is to say, they were connected with salvation. Okay? And during the simple ceremony of taking the crusade vow, called taking the cross, or simply crossing, a knight would vow to make a pilgrimage to and pray at the Holy Sepulchre. In order publicly to exhibit and to remind himself of the solemnity of his promise, the new crusader would sew a cross into his garments. Regardless of hardship, adversity, or temptation, therefore, the crusader was bound by sacred obligation to complete or to attempt to complete the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So the knight thus was, I say for a third time, in case I haven't gotten the point across, was first and foremost a pilgrim, okay? Nothing, I repeat, in the earliest terminology of the sources distinguished the Crusades from pilgrimages. The vow the crusader took bore remarkable resemblances to the one pilgrims made. As finally developed by canon lawyers in the century following Urban's sermon, the crusader vow was to make what was customarily regarded as a pilgrimage, though of course it was in addition a military expedition. In fact, crusaders could not only be identified by their crosses, but also with the scrip and the staff that ordinarily distinguished a pilgrim. Okay? Now, as mentioned, many pilgrimages were undertaken voluntarily as acts of devotion by pious Christians. Others were imposed or involuntarily accepted as part of medieval penitential discipline. Put next to the plans of Gregory VII, Urban's innovation was to emphasize the liberation of the Holy Land over the reconquest of Asia Minor and to couple it with the idea of pilgrimage. The Crusaders' vow was occasionally accompanied, and not unimportantly, by additional promises. These could include practices like fasting and abstinence, by special devotions the Crusader intended to perform during the course of his journey, the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and so forth. Indeed, by taking vows, by wearing special clothing, by practicing abstinence, by mortifying his body, by undertaking other sorts of religious observances, a Crusader may have seemed outwardly, at least, rather like a monk. Thus, the Crusades, in the irresistible words of one historian, might have looked like a military monastery on the move. Though Urban did not conceive the crusade indulgence, he did emphasize it, as did all his successors. All crusaders were imagined by popes, preachers, and knights. All crusades, were imagined by popes, preachers, and knights to be penitentially efficacious. Indeed, had this not been the case, the summons to the crusades would almost certainly have attracted much thinner numbers to take up the cross. The indulgence was based first on Christian conviction that Christ's sacrifice generated a prodigious volume of spiritual merit, and second, that the church had the power to dispense part of that merit to a sincere penitent. Generally speaking, indulgences allowed a recipient to substitute some meritorious act for penance, sacramental confession. The quantum of penance, and penance in this age was principally expressed, especially in non-theological literature, as well as in presbyteral and lay understanding, in quantitative or arithmetical terms. So the quantum of penance remitted depended in part on the nature of the meritorious act. Thus, giving alms, for example, would remit some portion of the penance owed to God. By contrast, the indulgence offered by Pope Urban was bestowed on those willing to take on the extraordinary familial and financial burden, not to mention risk of death, involved in every crusade enterprise. To these men, therefore, he promised full remission of sin, or at least full remission of penance to those who fulfilled their vow and who confessed their sins sacramentally. In other words, the indulgence earned the crusader not simply gratitude or honor, but religious merit. And merit in the 11th century meant not secular distinction or honor, but, if you like, religious credit. In this sense, we might say the war undertaken by the Crusaders was not only just, it was also, and I want to suggest more essentially, thought by all Christian participants to be justifying. Let me emphasize here that the indulgence was not a painless evasion. We know now that the majority of those who went on the First Crusade were killed or died. A traditional pilgrimage, even if it involved fasting, would not have been nearly so deadly. For this reason, when we consider the motivations of the Crusaders, we would, I think, do well to stress the religious elements of motivation. And we should, in my view, significantly de-emphasize the secular motives that have sometimes been imputed to them, to the Crusaders, particularly in the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century. Here I want to avoid the confusing clutter of strategies and military battles and equipment and focus on the passionate, pious feelings, religious feelings of those concerned. Those feelings included, first, a fierce, even feudal loyalty to their Lord, in this case, to a divine Lord, Christ. Okay. A sense of outrage that their Lord's patrimony, land, and tomb had, in their view, been unjustly taken and held by those they regarded and called infidels. An insult taken, too, that Christian pilgrims could visit the Holy Land only on the sufferance of, again, in their eyes, idolaters and pagans. Now, another powerful religious motivation for all pilgrims, including the Crusaders, has to do with the singular place of Jerusalem in the medieval religious imagination. One historian has described medieval Christendom's preoccupation with Jerusalem as, quote, obsessive. That passion was certainly felt and fostered by the papacy. All understood Jerusalem geographically to be at the center of the world. And in terms of religious geography, it was, of course, the site of Jesus' passion, death, burial, and resurrection. Jerusalem and the Holy Land are themselves best imagined in medieval religious terms as colossal relics. Why? Well, these were lands that virtually radiated with sacred power. Supernatural energy had been absorbed into the very sands of the eastern Mediterranean. These were lands soaked in the religious imagination with the deeds of the prophets, the apostles, the first followers of Christ, and above all, Christ himself. Churches and shrines dedicated to the apostles, to Mary, and to Christ dotted the landscape. It thus easily eclipsed, as a desirable pilgrimage destination and a locus of sacred power, other such great centers of relic accumulation, like Rome or Santiago or Constantinople. Beyond this, the Holy Land was understood to be the physical inheritance, the patrimony of Christ. And it's for this reason that no text of Scripture was to be quoted more often in connection with crusading than the opening words of Psalm 78. Quote, O God, the heathen has come into thine inheritance. O God, the heathen has come into thine inheritance. Read prophetically, this text was in the 11th century interpreted to mean that the bequest of Christ to his followers was then occupied and unjustly by a barbarous infidel who could be dispossessed by just resort to violence. This, incidentally, is why Urban also subtly but surely broadened the scope of the military expedition to include not just the rescue of Eastern Christians, but the liberation of all the lands in the Levant, Jerusalem above all, from unjust Muslim occupation. Indeed, the liberation of a place, Jerusalem, came to eclipse in Urban's imagination, I think, the liberation of a people, namely the Christians of the East. Now, in several respects, Urban had chosen, or at least taken advantage of, an auspicious moment to make such an appeal. Between roughly 1060 and 1090, the barely domesticated Normans, since 1059 locked into an alliance with the papacy, had taken Sicily from Muslim control. In addition, the 7th century-long reconquest of Spain, which had fallen into Muslim hands 400 years earlier, had enjoyed several notable successes in Urban's own lifetime. Thus, the dawning and then intoxicating sense that Christian forces could dispossess Islam and recover territory, all Westerners agreed, that belonged to Christianity, this sense was virtually ubiquitous in the West. Finally, and in military terms, crucially, the Turks were then, happened to be, politically disunited and thus militarily split. Though no pope or prelate or knight knew it, no more advantageous moment for an army from the west to strike could then have been imagined. And so in these circumstances, between 60,000 and 100,000 soldiers set out for the Holy Land. This, after the unauthorized People's Crusade, led to the slaughter and enslavement of thousands of artisans, other kinds of non-combatants in just a few nights, as well catastrophically in the massacre of several communities in the German Rhineland. Okay. After this unfortunate catastrophe, four large armies joined up, okay, and after converging on Constantinople in May of 1097, they almost immediately conquered the Seljuk capital city of Nicaea, and that's the city, of course, where the First Ecumenical Council was held in, which produced the first version of the Nicene Creed. Now, a hard-fought victory at Dorylaeum in July 1097, opened the route across Asia Minor. And when the Crusaders reached the city of Antioch, they were nearly exhausted and deeply demoralized. The discovery of the true lance that had pierced Christ's side in the crucifixion revived their spirits. Remoralized by Bohemond of Taranto's solo act of mounting the ramparts of Antioch, the Crusaders improbably took this extremely well-fortified city in June of 1098. Okay. Okay. Later, a fragment of the true cross was discovered. Okay. Both relics were later taken into battle. They were thought to protect the holder from death. Conquering and passing through famous landmarks enhanced the sense that the Crusaders were destined for a great triumph. Cities like Tyre, visited by Christ, Caesarea, where the Apostle Peter had preached, and Emmaus, where Christ appeared after his resurrection. In any case, Jerusalem now lay within reach. Okay. There, by the way, is Adhemar of Monte, a bishop carrying the Holy Lance into battle. Okay. And there we can see Jerusalem bathed in supernatural light. And I want us to pay attention, particularly for those of you interested in historiography. I know there's a class of you taking historiography. In these black and white illustrations, all of which were made for a French history of the Crusades in the late 19th century, which was then translated into English and read widely in North America, and represents very well the way in which the Crusades would have been represented in history books and in art in the 25 years before the name Crusaders was adopted. Okay. In July 1099, the Crusaders improbably, miraculously, magically took the Holy City. Okay. The Crusade armies had to overcome lack of military coordination, unimaginable physical privation, and want of crucial military equipment like siege engines. Knowing this, the Crusaders could only conclude that God had indeed willed their victory, and when they did finally achieve victory in Jerusalem, they also were said to have shouted out Deus Vult, right? The same thing that the knights at Clermont had shouted out in 1096. Yet the lack of Muslim political unity, which was a crucial element in the Crusaders' victory, was to prove all too ephemeral. By 1187, the Kurdish general Saladin had retaken Jerusalem and soon most of the Holy Land. Okay, this is one of the turning points in Saladin's victory over the Western Crusaders, okay, or this represents. Subsequent crusades were replete with folly and failure, including the drowning of an emperor and civil war among the Latin powers. The Fourth Crusade ended with a sacking by the Crusaders themselves of Constantinople and the plundering of Hagia Sophia. It thus ironically made the Eastern Empire more vulnerable to attacks from the Ottoman Turks, rather like the way in which the Second World War, which began with the intent of delivering Poland from Nazi aggression, ended with the delivery of that country to the Soviet Union. In 1291, the last Latin holding in the Levant was lost, and with its loss, the Crusades to the Holy Land came to an ignominious end. Okay, I'd like to spend the rest of the time allotted to me briefly discussing the historiography of the Crusades, that is, how they have been received, studied, and evaluated in the past 10 centuries. Though I'll concentrate on Christian historiography, and more particularly Western Christian historiography, permit me to say just a few words about Islamic historiography, which I find really interesting. Now, where one early European chronicler labeled the First Crusade the greatest event in world history since the resurrection, the Crusades were almost unknown in the Muslim world until the 18th century. Given how often the term crusader is used as a term of hostility in political discourse today, it's startling to realize that the Crusades were not even regarded as worthy of attention for most of the second millennium. When considered at all, they were usually regarded as insignificant and fruitless attempts to impede the ineluctable expansion of Islam, tiny wounds in the side of the great Turkish empires, which quickly moved into and took over territories that were traditionally Christian. In fact, no history of the Crusades was translated into Arabic until 1865, and none published by a Muslim scholar until 1899. For Muslim scholars, the Crusades were an episode not in their history, but in that of the Europeans. Only in the 19th century was there even an Arabic word for crusader, a loan word from the West. Critically, the Arabic term became commonly used for Christians and Westerners in general only with the rise of Arab nationalism and anti-imperialist and, in particular, anti-British sentiment during the period of mandatory British overrule in the early 20th century. It was then, and only then, that Saladin, shorn of his Kurdish identity, was resurrected as a hero and symbol of the Arabic struggle against the West, and especially in opposition to British imperialism. In short, the Crusades were virtually ignored and thus unknown by most Muslims until the 20th century. The Islamicist Claude Cohen could not have summarized the Islamic point any better than when he described the Crusades as a Western phenomenon, while Francis Robinson labels them, accurately I think, as mere pinpricks from the point of view of Islam. Let me just note before proceeding that I'm not planning to say anything here tonight about Byzantine Christian or Jewish historiography, but as students of historiography here know, almost needless to say, how one studies a particular historical episode depends an awful lot on one's religious and political perspective, among other things. Not surprisingly, Eastern Christian and Jewish historians view the Middle Ages as we Westerners do, through a lens particular to their traditions, and that lens colors the way in which they portray and interpret the Crusades. Okay, so into the Western study of the Crusades then. Now, Western Christian historiography through the 15th century was dominated by recognition of the significance of irredentism. That is, restoration of territory to its rightful owners in Crusader motivation. One historian sums up this position very well by stating, quote, "Every Christian reference to lands that had once been Christian, and particularly the Holy Land, must be understood to have been made on the assumption that these were lost provinces belonging by right to the Latin Church." Throughout the 16th century, scholars emphasized the defensive character of the Crusades as they were seen by medieval Christians who believed that Christendom and Christianity were genuinely threatened by an infidel power that had already overrun much of the historic Christian world and that threatened to take over the remainder. Almost all consider the First Crusade in particular a response to Muslim threats to Christian holy places and peoples in the East. In general, through this first period of Western historiography, scholars reflected the attitudes of most Christians in the West. Now, with the dawn in the 16th century of the Reformation, we move into the second era of Western historiography. Not surprisingly, confessional differences colored attitudes towards the Crusades, especially with the outbreak in the 17th century of the wars of religion. Nonetheless, both Catholics and Reformers saw themselves as soldiers of Christ, fighting in defense of Christianity against forces of evil. With the Enlightenment, which of course grew in part out of weariness with religiously motivated wars, rationalist writers by and large denounced the Crusades. Voltaire, for example, imagined the Crusaders as motivated by, quote, a thirst for brigandage. And Edward Gibbon spoke quite censoriously of the, quote, savage fanaticism of the Crusaders. Among American writers, Ralph Waldo Emerson placed the Crusades among, quote, the monuments of folly, and tyranny in the West. Now, under the influence of nationalism and romanticism, obviously with an uppercase R, a sympathetic attitude towards the Crusades and the Middle Ages in general emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries, especially with those disaffected by secularization and other elements of modernity. The Crusaders were depicted favorably in virtually all forms of Western culture, notably in the novels of Sir Walter Scott and in the illustration of French artists such as Gustave Doré, the one that we're going to be focusing on tonight. And he did this, as I say, for an influential and widely read and widely translated history of the Crusades. Okay? It's these images on which I'd like to focus tonight, as the book and the illustrations Doré supplied for it marked a high point in religious enthusiasm for the Crusades in France and almost coincide with the founding of the college in 1843. So what I'll do is I'll have us all just look at these slides together, okay, and not comment on them, and then you can comment on them in the question and answer period, and then I'll conclude. I just have a few concluding remarks afterwards, okay? So a couple of favorite motifs to start. A crusader leaving his family behind, right, with the army standing and waiting for him. And an even more popular motif, a crusader returning with his family gathered faithfully around a crucifix. And you can see from the buildings in a distance that this was a very wealthy kind of a very wealthy crusader. This is, I mentioned the Battle of Nicaea at Asia Minor by Doré. What's interesting here is what's happening in the sky. It's hard to describe that exactly, whether it's a theophany or it's some kind of apparition or theophany or appearance of the divine, an indication of support for the divine and so forth. And you can see some of the crusaders pointing to it in the sky. In fact, the first crusaders did experience many, many apparitions and even astrological events, which were also recorded in China and Korea. So we know they did occur, and they took all of these to be indications of support for God and the justice of their cause. And there's a priest with a cross encouraging the crusaders. Again, you can see heavenly light shines on the crusaders at the center. And crusaders in the Judean mountains. And this is meant to call up and to link the first crusade to the march of the Israelites to the Promised Land. One apparition that recurred in the first crusade was that of St. George here on the Mount of Olives. Okay. And an angel with a sword and banner leading the crusaders to the Holy Land. You can see them all looking up at this angel. Okay, again, a sign of divine approbation. And then one of the Frankish leaders, triumphant Godfrey of Bouillon, enters Jerusalem, his army, quote, as the author puts it, having prevailed over the Saracens, or as, and here's the crusaders fulfilling their vow, praying at the edicula of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And finally, in 1925, the article indicating that the moniker Crusaders had been chosen by a student body because, interestingly, the tomahawk was found to be offensive. Note, though, that the Chiefs received 17 votes, even though the tomahawk was thought to be found defensive. So, okay, let me just make a couple of concluding remarks, and then we can open it up for discussion. Now, in the 20th century, some scholars, in the wake of the experience of the Second World War, and especially in view of how it ended in the Pacific Theater, became quite critical of the Crusades. Some regarded the Crusades as inspired by nothing more than religious fanaticism. Others argued that they were the first expression of a new aggressive spirit in the West. A number of others contended that the Crusade adumbrated the long history of Western colonialism to come. In fact, in 1995, one scholar went so far as to describe the Crusades, whether more recklessly or more risibly, I couldn't say, as, quote, a movement of violent white supremacist colonialism. Now, one can certainly understand the horror inspired by the experience of total war and the immense risk of living in a thermonuclear age, fears many of us in this room tonight have ourselves experienced. For our purposes, I simply note that these scholarly emotions and political conditions transformed the largely favorable view of the Crusades widespread in the West in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And I must stress that the conclusions that emerge from these natural fears and even honorable convictions have misled many readers, sometimes grossly and almost always anachronistically. In the 20th century, some economic historians, especially those sympathetic with Marxism, argued that the Crusaders were motivated largely by greed and self-interest. Wholly unsupported, I think, by the sources, this view is based on ideological assumptions rather than on historical evidence, and it's largely been refuted. Now, most historians acknowledge the Crusaders' sincerity and genuine religious inspiration and aspirations. Naturally, most also recognize that altruistic and selfish motives could have been and probably were mixed, consciously or unconsciously, in the minds of individual Crusaders. Yet that most Crusaders had to mortgage lands and other property, that very few, none practically, returned home any wealthier, that all risked death and many died en route or in battle. All of this strongly seems to suggest that the Crusades reconciled the knighthood's need to fight with the widespread religious desire for salvation by offering forgiveness of sin, necessarily implicated in homicide. The view of 20th century economics that the Crusades were, as one has put it, an essential part of a wealth maximizing strategy is thus one, I think, that has been put forward by those oblivious to the mobilizing power of medieval religious fervor. Otherwise, it would be very hard to explain why so many walked away from some of the richest lordships in Europe, left wife and children, set out on a poorly choreographed and poorly provisioned expedition, and one in which the possibility of death was all too real. In fact, it was so real that a majority of those who went on the First Crusade died in battle or en route to the Holy Land or on their way home. So by the end of the 20th century, a scholarly consensus has more or less been achieved, at least in the West and among Western scholars. Almost all scholars now emphasize the defensive nature of the Crusades, as both popes and crusaders viewed them. Medieval Christians saw that much of the once Christian world had been overwhelmed. Far from being victims of proto-imperial invasion, the Turks, and I say this simply as a matter of historical fact and not as a moral commentary, the Turks were regarded of the two parties as expansionist aggressors. Eastern Christians, not Muslims, were in the view of most Christians then and scholars today the primary victims of this aggression. Having overrun much of the Christian world, including Jerusalem and the Holy Land, the Turks threatened to take over the remainder. Virtually every historian and chronicler of the expedition, later known as the First Crusade, viewed it as a response to Muslim aggression and menace to the Eastern Christians and Eastern holy places and peoples. We see things differently today, but the views of popes and participants, to which I've already alluded, represent the convictions and feelings of virtually all Christians in the Middle Ages. Now, the college moniker was founded at a moment in history then when the term crusader was founded with almost entirely positive meanings and implications, shrouded in the lights and hues of the illustrations of Gustave Doré. The college first adopted the moniker Crusader when this positive view still prevailed, even if criticisms were expressed by ideologues with whom the Catholic world then had little sympathy. The historiography of the Crusades, thus, is essential in helping us to determine why the Jesuit founders of the college wanted to associate its students with the image of the Crusader. Now, it's not for me to say, nor has it been any part of my intention to say or to imply whether the college ought to retain or to relinquish its historic moniker. My intention, rather, has nowhere better been expressed than by the great German theologian Ernst Troeltsch, with whom I will conclude my formal remarks. In normative and moral matters, Troeltsch once insisted, historians ought not to have the last word, but it may be helpful if they are permitted the first. If my first strictly historical remarks tonight are of any use to the college's forthcoming discussions, I will be quite grateful. So for your kind invitation to deliver these remarks and for your attention tonight, I close by extending to you all my genuine thanks. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Professor Madigan, thank you very much for your learned and erudite remarks. I want to preface my comment by indicating that I'm taking no position whatsoever on whether the college chooses to retain a team name or not, because I'm inclined to think that events that happened 800 or 1,000 or more years ago have a little bearing or significance, right or wrong. Clashes of civilizations have characterized human history and are not going to be undone. What concerns me, however, and I know you said that you were not going to move in this direction, is that if one gives this portrait of what the Crusades were, focused on the Holy Land, one omits, if I may use a Machiavellian expression, their effectual truth in Europe. Their effectual truth, as you know, was the massacre of many thousands of Jews who were not combatants, who took no aggressive actions, who were slaughtered, yes, for gain, and also for the joy of bloodlust. Popes like Innocent VII, I jotted down the other, I'm drawing here on Solomon Greitz's classic History of the Jews, Volume 3, which recounts in some summary all this. Although I know what's recently inspired laments about the team name is feeling, gee, we weren't kind to Muslims, to which the response would be, well, gee, why did they take Spain in the first place? In the case of the Jews, all they sought was not to conquer any land, but to live in peace. And in the name of the Crusades, they were slaughtered, as I'm sure you know as well or better than I do, all around Europe. Shouldn't that really be mentioned in this occasion?
Well, I thank you for mentioning it. I guess I would say that had we whirled enough in time, I certainly would have mentioned it, and it may have been my mistake not to mention it. Part of my charge was to help us to understand why the moniker had been adopted by the college, and for that purpose, I think concentration on Western Christian historiography made sense. I do know Jewish historiography very well. Actually, I'm very, very interested. I teach courses in the history of Jewish-Christian interaction, and the history of Christian-inspired anti-Semitism is something that I really care about, and I think all Christians should care about. What happened in the Rhineland was inexcusable. It was catastrophic. More than that, many Jewish scholars looking back over history, asking themselves, when did relations between Jews and Christians really begin to go downhill, have come to the conclusion that really for about a millennium, relations between the two religious communities were really quite good, and that's true. In fact, one scholar has looked at policies, popes, princes, other powerful people, let's say from the period of the fall of the Roman Empire, just say 500, until the First Crusade, and then has concluded with perhaps too much exactitude that only 2% of these leaders pursued policies that were in any way anti-Semitic. So lots of Jewish scholars, as you probably know, point to the First, Second, and Third Crusades as the point of where things began to deteriorate. I think that's basically right. I guess, in a full discussion of whether the college ought to retain this name, absolutely. The massacre of utterly innocent Jews in the Rhineland and in other places in Europe should certainly be brought up. So I thank you for bringing it up.
I'm much more concerned with clarity about the historical issue than engaging about names, about whether team names should be changed. I'm fine with allowing the Redskins myself.
Other questions? Kevin, I might ask, you're talking about motivation, and there's a way that a person could come at this and look and say, problematic as it is, the contemporary notion of jihad is very much like, and we might problematize jihad. Can we problematize jihad and allow the Christian notion I know that we can look at it as historians and say what it is. Mm-hmm. How do you think about the comparison?
Mm-hmm. Well, one question that quite naturally comes up is whether the Islamic notion of jihad had any influence on the Christian concept of crusade, and the conclusion is that there's no influence whatsoever. If we think in large terms about what history is, it's a reconciliation of the past with the present, right? And because the past is not in flux, but the present is, the past is always going to be reinterpreted. Okay, so while in 1925 there was little reason, I think, for the college to hesitate about allowing students to adopt the moniker, subsequent history, subsequent politics have changed, and that requires us, I think, to look at the Crusades in a different way. So those realities, I think, have to be taken into account. They have to be used to problematize the crusade. And they make it, I think, much, much harder to embrace the moniker, or to continue to embrace the moniker unambiguously, unproblematically. But my point really was to, first of all, to demonstrate how medieval crusaders understood themselves. Again, I was basically giving a talk, a history talk, and to talk a little bit about how it was interpreted before, just when these issues of Arab nationalism and Western colonialism and British rule and so forth, just when those were becoming problematic. So I think all those things and other historical events and political developments should be taken into account to problematize the crusade. I just didn't understand that to be my charge
No,
tonight.
I
Yeah.
understand that.
Very nice talk, Kevin. I enjoyed it. I was thinking about going back to the mindset. Sorry, about the mindset of the medieval crusaders, and obviously reclaiming the Holy Land was principal in that mindset.
Yeah.
Was there any apocalyptic or any drive for a notion that they were perhaps helping to usher in the return of Christ to the Holy Land and so on? Was that in the thinking or not?
That's a good question. A book that has been very recently published that argues that very point. But if that is the case, Steve, I, so far in the documents, have not actually seen that. That said, there are reams of documents in the Crusades, and this is not an area in which I consider myself expert. I don't read chronicles and chronicles of, the Crusades. So the material could be out there. If so, it's going to be a new interpretation, so we'll just have to see how the reviews come in. But I don't know of any other scholar except this particular person who's really put that out there. Yeah.
Jim?
That talks, yeah. Is he speaking? It's speaking. I better stand up just to make my see who I'm talking to. I'm Jim Powers. I'm a professor of history here a long time, but now emeritus, who taught history of the Crusades over the course of those years. So I'm some involvement in what's going on. I have to admit, in the final analysis, there's a huge ambivalence because the Crusades are such an enormous movement with so many characteristics and so much of a historic role that it's very hard to sit back and say bad or good or deserves to be a moniker, doesn't deserve to be a moniker. It almost seems as though that issue is simplifying the Crusades as being far simpler than they are. But I can tell you one thing that always kind of stuck in my craw when I taught the Crusades, a part that I guess remains the most negative section. That chant, which they burst out with initially at Clermont, when the Crusade is being called Deus le Volt, God wills it, is the same chant they will use when they are slaughtering, to give a reference to Professor Schaeffer's comments, the largely Jewish population of Jerusalem in 1099 when they take it. Now they're desperate, they're tired, they've been through holy hell getting to Jerusalem, and it's taken them 4 years. And you can at least anticipate, humanly anticipate the kind of breakdown that takes place in the conquest of the city. But to have them chanting that, to connect this with the will of God, first of all, is to understand what a powerful drug connecting your religion to violence can mean. And so many, not just in Christianity either. It's at the core of jihad as well. But the notion when you say that and see people engaged on either side doing it, is to call in mind the Christ who told Peter to turn the other cheek, who praised the peacemakers, and suggests that this God is willing what they're doing, is a very uncomfortable point. To me, maybe the most uncomfortable point in the whole debate, and maybe what sticks in the craw of trying to decide whether we can still handle this as a moniker. I say that with still a certain ambivalence about, as you are, as to whether one should drop it or keep it. And also, like Professor Schaeffer, born in Washington, D.C., and I'm equally ambivalent about the Redskins. Thank you.
Anything you want to say or no?
No, I essentially agree with that. I can imagine some scholars coming back at you and saying, okay, but Christianity is a living religion, and Jesus of Nazareth did not anticipate certain, insofar as we can recover anything about Jesus of Nazareth, which is very, very little, as you know, did not anticipate, Muslim-Christian interaction, right, or how ideas would develop over time. Paul himself says that, just to put scripture against scripture, that the sword wasn't given to the government of the world for no reason at all, And as you know very well, Augustine, with all his hesitations, came to the conclusion that violence could be used for the purposes of God, licitly or innocently. Now, I don't know what to do with that morally. It puts me in an uncomfortable place, as it does you. And to say that God willed that kind of violence or that kind of massacre, it's revolting, of course. I don't think any historian feels comfortable with that. I just think what we as historians, what you as an historian want to do is to explain as honestly as possible why it is that Crusaders and something which is so revolting to you, to me, to Professor Schaefer, would not have been found revolting in July of 1099. Indeed, that would have been found to be an expression of the will of God. So what we do as historians, right, is one thing. What we do as citizens, as alumni and alumnae of Holy Cross, as professors who teach at Holy Cross, is to come to terms with the past as it was and to see how continuous with the past we want to remain. And it could be that the massacres to which you and Professor Schaefer have referred, and the notion that God willed those massacres, is so revolting that the college would and should drop its moniker for a new one.
Professor Frost, we have to see if we get any students too after that.
I appreciate again the great complexity of this issue, and I fear it almost casts the medieval Christianity in a light that may be a little bit too stark right now. Because if you look back to Spain, and my distinguished colleague Professor Powers has done a lot of work on the Spanish medieval period, there were other models of Christianity and other models of living with a neighbor, with a Muslim neighbor, with a Jewish neighbor in Spain. The convivencia was called in Spanish, and it's a difficult topic because it isn't as clean as it appears. It wasn't a great kumbaya time either. Mm-hmm. But I think it's very important to highlight the fact that the Crusades were not the sole voice of Christian piety at the time. There were great social changes. There were great movements toward legislation, great movements forward in civil society, thanks in large part to the relationship between Moors, Jews, in Spain in particular, but I think also in other territories where there weren't knights, but just folks living next to one another and having to live a life. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if we could look in that too to find some models that would be a little, well, at least lend depth and maybe a more, I don't know, hopeful perspective at this point when things are so charged.
I agree with that too. Yeah.
Sure.
I did not mention that I'm also a Spanish historian and lectured on convivencia many times in my courses because the Spanish Reconquest is also one of my fields. And I also don't like to think I put a kind of aspersion on this thing. You know, God, we can't consider it. These Christians were acting in excess to the point that they were self-contradictive because the population of Jerusalem fell so badly after this that they were decades getting enough of a population back to hold the city and hang on to it because they had gone well beyond, any kind of rational means. It's the thrust of war. You stop thinking about Christ and all those other things when you get carried away. I also want to say, since I seem to put a kind of death knell on the term Crusader, that the Crusades had some positive aspects. One of the ones I think that sticks the most in my mind is that they did increase the encounter between Greek Church and Western Church. In the process of that encounter, a lot of intellectuals who made their way to the libraries in Constantinople discovered that the complete corpus of Aristotle and the complete corpus of Plato was sitting available that they thought had been lost all these centuries. Suddenly the Greeks had preserved it. The result was a huge intellectual revival in the last half of the 12th century and into the 13th, of which St. Thomas Aquinas is the most famous practitioner, that suggests that that is a powerful good which probably wouldn't have happened if there had not been the Crusades to bring the ties between Constantinople and Rome somewhat closer. So it isn't all negative.
Thank you. Any student questions? I'm happy to come to faculty, but any other students, things you weren't clear about or want to ask about?
I just had one kind of general question about the fact that most people are focused and very concerned right now on the issue of religious warfare and religion being a very big motivating factor behind violence. Right. But just as a symbol, if the Crusader is a symbol of religious violence, does other symbols of secular violence, are those less significant just because they don't have religious motivation? Like, for example, is a Crusader worse than a Spartan? Because they're both warriors, they're both extremely brutal, and both killed millions of people. So can you weigh one kind of more heavily than the other, just on the basis of religion?
Two things occur to me. One is that some of our colleagues have already brought up the problem of yoking religious fervor with the commission of violence, and that's obviously very serious. But the second thing is, I think the answer to your question would depend very much on at what point in history you're asking such a question. At our moment in history, the question of the West's relationship with the Islamic world is the live, one of the very live, political, global questions in our time. But it wasn't in the 19th century, so I think it depends very much on the particular moment at which you're asking those questions. Today, I would say Crusader is a much more fraught term than Spartan, right? Partly because it's used in political discourse as a term of opprobrium, right? And partly because of the unfortunate conflict that the West has with Islam. Okay, yeah.
Thanks, Kevin. You talked about the centrality of Jerusalem as a motivating factor in the development of the Crusade. Is there a present-day analysis or analogy that you would see within the Islamic world in the divide between Sunni and Shia with regard to the custody of the holy places, Medina, Mecca, and it's led to violence between those two sects within that?
Right.
Is there a present-day analogy there?
Yeah, excellent question. Is there an Islamicist in the room?
He's on leave.
He's on leave. That's a great question. I just couldn't say without hazard.
Oh, last question then.
Now I have pressure to ask a good question. So you gave a great talk about sort of the historiography and how we've understood the Crusades from an intellectual perspective. Could you say a little bit about then culturally how things shifted in the 60s, 70s, 80s? I mean, right now the KKK newspaper is called the Crusader, right? And so how do we go from this understanding in the 20s of the Crusaders being a pilgrim and having somewhat, not having the context it does today, to culturally or commonly understanding of this being a very loaded term? Maybe that's not a fair question.
No, it's a very fair question, and it has everything to do with things I was talking about at the end. Real Western imperialism, in the 19th and 20th century, particularly British imperialism. The rise of Arab nationalism. again, before these historical political developments, again, the Crusades and the Crusaders were just simply not part of the history. So one way of explaining the historical change that you've just identified is to say that historical and political events compel people to reach back into their unknown history, or history that's not very well known, and retrieve certain symbols and events, and sometimes to reconfigure them, right, so that a Kurdish general suddenly becomes Arabic, right, as a symbol of Arabic resistance to the West and so forth. So it's really those major political developments in Palestine, the establishment of the State of Israel, all those things up to 1950 in particular, that caused that change from Crusader being an innocuous term, right, or non-controversial term in 1925 to it being a very fraught term today.
Well, thank you. You've been in the middle of the force field. I appreciate your willingness to step into that to help us understand the world of the medieval people who lived through and participated in the Crusades and how our thinking about it got here. So,
Okay.
anyway, thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks, Tom.